Welcome everybody. I just want to get everything ready here. Just going to put on. All right. Can everybody hear me? I hope so. Yes, no?
Yes,
I can
Eldred,
hear you.
Good. All right. Okay. Just want to get into my presentation quickly. Or share screen. Just want to quickly check. I just want to have everything on the screen before me. Or share screen. Let's have a look here. Moet jy gaan hierso? Okay, that one there. Sorry, everybody. I'm just getting everything ready. I'll be with you in a second.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's it done. And that one in.
Sorry. All right, there you go.
Okay, can everybody see the screen?
We can see the screen. You just need to say slideshow so that there we go.
Okay, so everybody's good, right? Here we go. Okay, so thank you, Estelle, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out to learn a bit more about gaming addiction. As the introduction said, I was a gaming addict for 20 years. And when I was a little boy, I always wanted to figure out how things work. So if I were to get like a small radio control car, I'll probably have it for one day and the next day will be in bits because I wanted to find out how it works. So with me, for my 20 years gaming addiction, after I ended everything, I thought to myself, okay, so let's try and see and find out why it happened. Like, what is the main thing? What drives us to gaming? Why gamers cannot stop even though they know it's wrong? So what is the mechanics driving the gaming addiction? Where does it come from? And especially from my background with physiology, trying to understand the neurophysiology, how everything works, how the neurotransmitters, the hormones work in the brain. And I think the most important thing to take away here today is if we're going to look for a solution, we need to understand the cause. There's no point in trying to look for a solution when we don't understand the mechanism of how things work. So let's move on. Yes, so the first thing is, do you ever feel as if you don't have the answers to behavioral changes in your child? Now, on this point, quickly, I just want to mention, if you're struggling with any kind of aggressive, rebellious behavior in a child, all of a sudden, so this child previously was very well mannered, but all of a sudden completely changed, becoming aggressive, rebellious, especially against other authoritative figures, then normally, mostly, it will be because of either gaming or excessive screen time. So let's go through a few interesting facts about gaming. So let's start off. The video gaming industry is now bigger than the movie and the music industries combined. So the very interesting thing here is when I studied on the revenue that I'm sure you're all familiar with Hollywood, and when they talk about, this movie brought in that much. If we're going to look at the total revenue that Hollywood brings in per year, you're looking at about $100 billion. If you look at the gaming industry is worth twice that much. So the gaming industry brings in about $230 billion per year, which is excessive. And if you're going to compare this with something like a titan, like the big pharmaceutical industry, the pharmaceutical industry in the world that everybody talks about is only 5 times bigger than the gaming industry. So this is statistics you will never hear So I just want to put this in a frame so you can understand that, this is a very big problem we're dealing with. Secondly, it costs more to develop a game than a movie blockbuster. So, quick example, I'm sure you're all familiar with the movie Maverick, Top Gun Maverick. Top Gun Maverick, the amount of money it cost to produce that movie was close to, I think, about 13 million. The last Call of Duty game that was released was more than that. So just to put it in a frame of the kind of money that we're talking about here. The best-selling video game of all time is Minecraft, which has sold over 200 million copies across all platforms. Since September 2021, the most popular video game in the world is Battle Royale game Fortnite. I'm sure you're all familiar with the name Fortnite. So we're going to talk a little bit about Fortnite. I can also tell you at the moment there's 5 big court cases pending, class action suits of parents that took Epic Games to court claiming that Fortnite is too addictive. So these court cases are still pending. So when we talk about the addiction and we talk about everything else, you'll see why the parents are getting very worried about the effects of these games specifically. So the video gaming industry, as mentioned before, is currently worth more than $200 billion, 3.1 billion gamers worldwide, and there's about 8 billion people on the planet, which actually means that 40% of the total world population are playing games. And that's kind of shocking if you think about it. So if you look at I'll put it to you this way, if you look at a small group of people, you can basically say that 4 out of 10 of those people, they play games. So male gamers between the age of 18 to 34 years old spend an average of 3.6 hours per day playing video games. Now, thinking about this, people normally think that when they talk about the age group of gamers, people normally think about 12, 13, 14 young teenagers. But statistically speaking, a gamer is between 18 and 34 years old. Actually, between 34 and 42 years old is the biggest demographic of gamers playing. So if you think about male gamers between 34 and 42 years old, you're basically talking about the fathers of families. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. This is a major problem because we have to also understand that kids learn by example and they're going to want to do what they see. So if daddy is playing games 3, 4, 5, or 6 hours a night, then little Johnny is going to follow his example too. More than 70% of children under 18 play games in the United States. 90% of children under 18 play games in South Africa. So why do you think this is? Well, let me put it to you this way. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with load shedding. So what is the first thing we do if we read on the phone tonight between 6 and 8 it's going to be load shedding? You grab your phone immediately and you make sure your phone is charged for load shedding. So what else are the children supposed to do during load shedding? So they try and obviously play games to entertain themselves. More than 50% of all games are played on mobile devices, which is very interesting. And now most games are now multi-platform. So they are very accessible. You need to understand also that the CPU, the processor that is inside a phone, a smartphone nowadays, is the same as the processors you will find in either Xbox, PlayStation, or a PC. So you have a very powerful computer in your pocket, very accessible. And that is the big thing here is if a child plays Xbox at home and they have to stop playing, they can maybe, let's say, go to school and keep on playing that game. So this is going to cause them to be more exposed to that game because it's just more accessible. So if we move on to the next one. So why do people play games? So this is very important. Firstly, it's for entertainment. So gaming is a form of entertainment. It's supposed to be exciting, challenging, engaging. And also it offers a sense of satisfaction and enjoyment. So nothing wrong with playing a game for entertainment. But you need to also realize is it doesn't always stay at just 1 hour. It normally goes to 1 hour, becomes 2 hours, 2 becomes 3, and 3 becomes 4. And we're also going to talk about that progression a bit later on in the presentation. Secondly, they are social. So this is a very, very, very important point I want to bring across to you. If you're going to talk about gaming to a child, let's say Johnny is in the class and Johnny is a withdrawn, let's say 12-year-old, and he's being bullied in class. Maybe mom and daddy has divorced, unhappy social circumstances at home. When he is put in front of a gaming console, that puts him on a clean social slate. So in other words, the people he's going to play with is not going to know anything about Johnny, that he's small, that he's been bullied, that he's maybe introverted, maybe that mommy and daddy has divorced and all the social circumstances at home. So to him, that is a neutral position for him to be in. And I cannot think about anything that's going to be more of a motivational factor for a child in that position, just to be in a neutral social standing with the people he's playing with. So thirdly, it's challenging. It improves the skills. So many games offer increased levels of difficulty to increase the engagement. So basically what happens here is as you're playing the game, you're going to play the game. If it stays on the same level, you're going to stop being entertained by the game. So what they do is they increase the levels, they increase level of difficulty, and that obviously causes increased levels of engagement in the game. Escapism, this is a very important point, not only for children, but very, very importantly for, well, I can say for adults and especially adult males. Games can offer a sense of adventure, exploration, fantasy that can help players forget their problems. So actually what's happening, and this is what I try to bring across in every presentation, is you're escaping, but you're actually escaping into captivity because you want to get away from the stressful factors at home or at work. You know, you just need 2-3 hours to get away. But what happens in your body and in your brain as your trauma center, and we'll explain it a little bit later, your trauma center is calmed down as you start playing games, which is good in a sense. But then that trauma center is basically inhibited to such an extent that you're gonna stop seeing that what you're doing is bad for you. And that's what I'm saying. It's actually escaping into captivity. It's also a constant measurable growth. So there's a feedback loop of positive reinforcement. So the thing what you have to remember here, I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, you ask a child, okay, would you prefer playing a game and seeing the rewards immediately? Or would you prefer studying hard and seeing better results in your math marks at the end of the year? That child will immediately tell you they want immediate results and they want to see it now. So that's the main motivational factor why children will choose gaming before they have to go study. And it kind of makes sense because we're a society that we want instant gratification, unfortunately. So another important point. It's competitive. Many people enjoy the competitive aspect of gaming, whether it is competing against each other, playing online, and also trying to beat their own scores. And this is also very important because in games nowadays, you normally get updates. So the game, in essence, doesn't stay the same because they release updates continuously. It increases the level of difficulty, increases the level of competition, and it basically makes the game infinite. So they can keep, I'll give you another example. Let's say, for example, the game World of Warcraft was released more than 15 years ago, but it's still being played today because of the constant updates. So you can really increase the longevity of any game just by providing regular updates to that game. And then it's creative. It's a sense of community. And this is very important also. A gamer, when they start playing games, they have people around them that share the same hobby, the same interest. For example, on gaming communities, gaming forums, people, all they talk about is about games. When people visit each other, all they talk about is games. So it's a sense of community, and that's also a big driving force for children too. It's because they have a sense of being part of a group of people with the same kind of familiar interests. And then the last one, boredom. So people play games because they're bored. And I mean, at the moment, it's very difficult, like I said, with load shedding. When you're sitting in the dark and you become bored, it's a major problem. So let's look at a brief overview of brain development from childhood to adolescence. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. I just want to give you an idea of what's happening. So from the age of 0 to 5 years old, there are certain things that is happening in the brain. So the basic brain structures and neural connections are being formed. So this stage is critical for the development of fundamental cognitive functions such as language acquisition, motor skills, and perception. So these skills are formed very, very early in a child's brain, before the age of 5 years. So we need to understand, when we talk about these different developmental areas, we need to understand that, okay, think about if this is the normal development that is needed in those specific areas, how will introducing gaming to those specific age groups affect these developmental stages? In the age group 6 to 11 years old, this is where there's a refinement of those neural connections that was formed in the initial stages. Brain regions responsible for language, memory, attention, and reasoning is further developed. Now, you also need to understand, if you look at ages 6 to 11 years old, this is normally where games are introduced to children. So you can understand, and obviously, if this is the age group where the brain regions are developed for language, memory, attention, and reasoning, there's going to be a problem specifically in those areas when gaming is introduced in this age group. And then also problem solving, logical thinking, abstract reasoning continue to improve in this group too. And then in the ages 12 to 18 years old, so this, if you look at teenagers, this is the biggest demographic group where games are being played. So in this stage, the frontal lobe is being developed. So the frontal lobe, we'll explain it to you a bit later when I talk about the brain physiology, but the frontal lobe is the area that is responsible for inhibition control and also responsible for your higher cognitive functions. For example, personality, IQ, etc. It's also the stage where the efficiency of brain of information processing is improved in specific areas. And in this stage specifically, these kids are very, very sensitive to their social circumstances, emotions, and peer group influence. So obviously, if you think about, for example, as Anke told you, if you introduce social media in this group, let's say, for example, in girls, where their social stature, emotions, peer group influence is very important, and you bombard them with the wrong kind of information with social media, you can see it's going to have a significant effect on the development of the brain, 12 to 18 years old, specifically because of the frontal lobe development. Okay, so if we move on, okay. So I'm going to play you a brief video, explain to you very shortly of how neuroplasticity works in the brain. So neuroplasticity is basically the ability of your brain to form new connections or to sever previous connections. It's a process that your brain uses to increase or decrease the time spent in processing information, to make things more time effective and more efficient. So let me explain this to you or show you the video quickly so you can see what this is about.
Neuroplasticity work? Well, think of your brain as a huge city with thousands of roads and lots of traffic. Some of these roads are faster than others, lots of traffic moving quickly and easily. These roads with all their traffic represent our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think, feel, or do something in the same way, we strengthen this road, making it faster, and it becomes quicker and easier for our brains to travel this pathway. But by contrast, if a road wasn't built well in the first place, or becomes blocked, or we think, feel, or do something differently, we start to use a different pathway. If we keep using that new road, our brains begin to use this pathway more and more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes automatic. In the meantime, the old pathway gets less and less used and weakens. In other cases, it may be possible to repair or rebuild the blocked pathway. This process of rewiring your brain by strengthening existing pathways, making new ones, weakening old ones, and repairing broken ones is neuroplasticity in action. So how does...
Okay, so let me put it to you very, very simply. Okay, if everybody can see this is a piece of clay, right? Okay, so let me explain it to you this way. So say, for example, this clay represents a function in the brain that is needed to do a specific thing. Let's say, for example, to do cycling, Johnny needs to be able to form a ball. All right, so this is needed for the brain to do a specific function, right? So let's say Johnny cannot ride a bike, but every day he tries more and more and more. So this is Johnny's function before he starts riding the bike. So every day as he practices, there's a bit of squishing here and squishing there. And as he's forming new pathways to be very effective in riding the bike, practice and practice and practice and learning the activity properly, in about a month or 2 months, Johnny will be able to do the cycling very effectively. So he's not going to think about it twice. He's going to hop on his bike. He's going to cycle. So because all these pathways, the neurons, the pathways are formed properly. So this is how can I put this? This is the process of neuroplasticity. So this is also very important with learning. So either learning through behavior or learning through tasting certain things, how things smell, how your brain actually works. So this is very important in the learning process. Very, very important. So think about this when we explain to you about how the different areas of the brain function. All right. So like I said, extremely important process in learning new behavior or activity. New pathways are formed to be energy and time efficient, and it's applicable for both positive and negative reinforcement. Now, this is very important. When we learn through the process of neuroplasticity, all right, let's say, for example, let's say you keep on telling Johnny, you know what? You're a very, very good tennis player. You are really very good. And as you reinforce that, Johnny begins to learn by forming this ball that I am a very good tennis player. So that is positive reinforcement. But now let's say, for example, Johnny at school, the people are bullying Johnny. Johnny, you are useless. You can't do anything. You're bad at everything you do. Also, same thing. The ball is forming and the ball is forming and the ball is forming. So what happens is negative reinforcement also forms that specific pathways in the brain. So it can be done either through a positive reinforcement, but also, unfortunately, through negative reinforcement. And this is also very important if you think about strongholds. If you think about the Bible explained to us about strongholds. So strongholds are negative thought patterns that we think about in the brain continuously. And the more we think about those thought patterns continuously, neuroplasticity in the brain is happening continuously. So it gets to a stage so advanced that anything you're going to think about, everything you're going to think about is only negative thoughts because your brain has been programmed to think that way, right? And also very important as we do this process, if we don't use certain neurons, there is a specific process which we call neural pruning, where your body will actually start shutting off certain neurons. So this happens because your brain has to be energy efficient. Your brain functions on glucose, and you only have a certain amount of glucose for your brain to function on. For example, a car drives on gas, petrol that you put in the petrol tank. When the petrol is done, the car stops working. Same thing with the brain. So if the glucose is depleted, the brain cannot work. So what happens is your brain says, okay, to use the specific amount of glucose I have, let's take away the neurons that are not important for this activity, so I can focus all the glucose I have on only the neurons I need for that activity. So I hope this makes sense of how neuroplasticity works.
How does
Okay, let's move on. Okay, so here we can explain to you quickly about, well, it's actually 4. Let's go back to the previous slide quickly. All right, so let's talk about the positive reinforcement feedback loop. In other words, the addiction loop. So why do we do certain things? Why are we addicted to certain things, and why can't we stop? So to talk about this, we need to understand that in our brain, as in our body, we have hormones, but in the brain, they are called neurotransmitters. In the body, they are called hormones. So hormones and neurotransmitters are basically messengers that makes one region of the brain communicate with another region of the brain, if that makes sense. So if we think about the main neurotransmitters in the brain, we're going to talk about dopamine, serotonin, and glutamate. So I'm sure you've heard about dopamine before. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that is responsible for reward and pleasure, for motivation, for mood and emotions, movement, control, attention, and focus. So let me explain to you quickly, very simply, how dopamine works. Say, for example, you eat ice cream for the first time. So as you're eating ice cream, dopamine is released in your brain, and dopamine tells your body, okay, what I've just done is really good. I want more of this. And because you have that reinforcement of dopamine in your brain, you take another bite. Or let's put it this way. You eat a bag of Doritos chips. You can never only eat one chip. You need to finish the whole packet. Why? Because when you're eating Doritos chips, dopamine is released. And you take one chip and dopamine says, okay, what you've now done is good. I want more of this. So you take another chip, more dopamine is released. So it's reinforcing something that you're experiencing as good. And we need to understand also, very importantly, this whole mechanism is not an evil mechanism, right? This was designed by God initially so we can appreciate the creation. I'll give an example. Let's say, for example, you're walking to school and you're walking past, let's say, a beautiful flower. You smell the flower and you think to yourself, wow, this flower really smells good. And then tomorrow you're going to walk past there again and you're going to take another smell at the flower because you know the flower smells good. So it's actually a good thing. Like, even the Bible tells us that God is a rewarder. So I always try to explain to people that God is a rewarder, but he also built a reward mechanism into your brain so you can appreciate his creation. And this is the reward mechanism. So yes, very, very interesting that, again, you can substantiate your biochemistry in the body with the word of God. And I always tell people, science and the word are not supposed to be opposite. Science is supposed to substantiate every single thing that's written in the Word of God. So people need to understand that, this is a very good example. The Word says God is a rewarder, and your biochemistry is proven to do exactly that. But unfortunately, since the devil has learned our behavior through many, many, many ages, he also knows how we work. And what he's doing at the moment is he's manipulating this against our body. So now we can't use it for good. It's actually used to be bad for us. So dopamine, like I said, dopamine is what we call an excitatory neurotransmitter. So it excites neurons. So if we think about, got a helicopter coming. Okay. So if you think about dopamine, dopamine excites neurons. So when it excites neurons, the neurons want more of what's happening. And in your body, you also have two nervous systems. You have what we call a fight or flight system, and we have what they call a relaxing system. We call it a sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic. So fight or flight is the one which is activated when you get frightened. So dopamine works with that fight or flight system. So think about it this way. If your body is continuously exposed to something that excites the body, like dopamine, is that good or bad? Your body cannot be in a constant state of fight or flight. That's not good. And when this happens in children, for example, it gets so much to their system that unfortunately they become very, very anxious. So they're overloaded in a flight or flight system. Right. So if we talk about serotonin, so serotonin is a mood regulator. It's important for anxiety and stress modulation. It's very important in the sleep-wake cycle. It's very important in learning and memory, attention, focus, and also cognitive flexibility. So dopamine gives you short spikes of joy or happiness, short spikes of happiness. But serotonin gives you joy. So what is the difference between happiness and joy? Happiness is temporary, but joy is permanent. So happiness is short-lived, but joy makes you feel content with life. Now, if dopamine increases in the body, serotonin will decrease. They always counterbalance one another. So let's say, for example, you're playing a lot of games. As you're playing games, dopamine is released into your brain continuously. So it drives the reward mechanism continuously. But as dopamine increases, serotonin decreases. And because serotonin decreases, you'll never find any addict that is content with life because they always lack serotonin. Just think about how many people you know that is currently on antidepressants. We talk about children that has to go on antidepressant medication because of low serotonin levels today, because we are a dopamine nation. We are driven by dopamine. And also very important, this mechanism does not change for specific kinds of addictions. Let's say you're addicted to alcohol, you're addicted to pornography, you're addicted to gaming, you're addicted to whatever. It doesn't really matter what you're addicted to. Any addiction mechanism functions on dopamine. So you're not addicted to alcohol, you're not addicted to games, you're addicted to dopamine. So it's very important to know that you are actually hooked because of dopamine. So if we look at the third neurotransmitter, we talk about glutamate. So glutamate is the most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain, excitatory neurotransmitter. So this one is what I always try and explain it to the people like this. Let's say you have a fire and you need, let's say, wood to combust to make the fire work. The wood is the dopamine. So if you were to pour either gasoline or paraffin or any accelerant on that fire, that will be glutamate. So what happens here is as dopamine is released, already exciting the neurons, glutamate comes in and make it even worse. So if we look at the functions of glutamate, it is responsible for excitatory signaling, learning and memory, sensory processing, neurotransmitter balance, and neurodevelopment. So very, very important to notice that for proper learning and memory and focus and attention to take place and learning to take place, it's crucially important that these three neurotransmitters, they have to be in balance. If they are not balanced, you will not be able to learn efficiently. You will not have focus. You will not have attention. And you're also going to have an interrupted sleep-wake cycle. So it's very important. If anything happens to the balance of these three neurotransmitters, you're going to have a child that's going to struggle with concentration, attention, focus. That's definitely going to happen. And also very importantly, if you look at neurotoxicity, it is possible for a neuron to get stimulated by dopamine so much that the neuron will die. And when the neuron dies, that is called neurotoxicity. Again, same principle applies to any kind of medication. Let's say you want to take one tablet today because you've got a headache. In a month's time, you're going to have to take 2 tablets to get the same effect. The same thing works here because it's known as the phenomenon of tolerance. So obviously, the more you get exposed to a certain kind of chemical, your body later wants more and more and more of that chemical to achieve the same result. And the same thing happens with this cycle. The more dopamine you need, the more tolerance you're going to develop. The more tolerance you develop, that indicates the cycle of addiction. So also important to note, you will see on the diagram of the brain, you have 4 pathways in which the dopamine is released into your brain. But we're just going to talk about the first 2. So the first one is the mesolimbic pathway. So the mesolimbic pathway distributes dopamine to the limbic system. Limbic system is your emotional center of the brain. That's where your body experiences emotions. The second one is a mesocortical pathway. So the mesocortical pathway is the cortex. It's the area in the brain, the frontal lobes, the area where you have inhibition control and the higher cognitive function. So imagine you have overstimulation of the emotional center of the brain and the part of the brain that is supposed to inhibit certain actions. Those 2 areas will either not function properly or shut down. And that is why children, especially, they really struggle these days to handle their emotions effectively. They cannot handle trauma. They cannot handle stress that well because they have a inhibited limbic system or emotional center of the brain. And also, secondly, I told you about the frontal lobes, the mesocortical pathway. Because you have inhibition of the brain, the part of the brain that's supposed to prevent you from doing certain things that you know is wrong, your brain can't stop those activities anymore. And that is exactly why you will have Johnny, which is a very good student, and he also helps everybody, helps the teachers carry their suitcases to the car. In a month's time, you're going to have Johnny bullying and hitting and yelling and screaming and swearing because of the inhibition of that second pathway that's supposed to prevent him from doing things that he knows is wrong. So this is in essence quickly how the addiction cycle in the brain works. Now, if we talk about the negative feedback system, so this is the limbic system. Remember I told you now there's 2 pathways, the mesolimbical and the mesocortical. This is the mesolimbical pathway. So let's talk about this one quickly. All right, so this emotional center of the brain mainly consists out of 2 regions. The first region is called the amygdala. So the amygdala is the area of the brain that processes fearful and threatening things that's going to happen to you. Let's say, for example, you're 5 years old, you run into mommy's kitchen and you by accident put your hand on a hot plate. It's going to burn your hand, and those sensory impulses will get processed in your brain. And then you know, okay, you're going to pull your hand away because it hurts you. So that, in effect, that is actually listed in your brain as being a threatening or a frightening event that happened there. When this happens, the amygdala will fire the other region we call the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is the area that's going to store a memory of that threatening event. So now you burnt your hand, it activates the hippocampus, and the hippocampus will store a memory long-term that you're never going to put your hand on a hot plate again because you experience pain. So it's stored in in long-term memory in the brain. Now, to put this, just to tell you this very, very quickly, is when we look at pornography specifically, the pornography gets stored in the long-term memory of the brain because a child experienced pornography as trauma. And this is exactly why. So in the amygdala, if a child exposed to pornography for 2 seconds, immediately inside him, something is going to say, okay, this is wrong. This is threatening. This is fearful. This is not normal. Okay. And then the hippocampus is going to store that in long-term memory. And that is why you're really going to struggle to get a child free from pornographic images that is stored in their head, because they experience that as trauma and it is stored in the brain as long-term memory. So, like I said, this limbic system is the trauma center of the brain. And if this system is not working properly due to excessive exposure to dopamine, it's going to affect how the child's going to experience trauma in their lives. And as we know, currently in our country specifically, we are exposed to a lot of trauma. I mean, you think about kids being bullied every day. They are scared going to classes, scared at night, exposure to darkness, all these things. So they're already exposed to a lot of trauma, more than other kids of their age. But now because of this thing kicking in, it's going to affect the way they experience trauma even worse. So if the system is compromised, you cannot protect yourself against potential trauma. So now, for example, if you play games, like explained to you initially, you start playing games causes this system to be calmed down. So this is why people, what they call escape. They escape from stress, because they escape from stress, the playing the games numbs this system. So they will experience a kind of sensation of, okay, I'm feeling less stressed now because I'm playing the game, because this system is shut down for a little bit. But now remember, this system is supposed to warn you against traumatic, fearful, and threatening events. So if you're playing a game and you know that what you do is wrong, but you can't stop what you're doing, it is because this system is numbed, it's inhibited. And that is why gamers will tell you, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I can't understand why I cannot stop. You cannot stop that addiction because this system is not working properly. So you can see how it's a whole mess of things that are happening. You know, firstly, you have the front part of your brain, the frontal lobe, which is supposed to be inhibition control, telling you that I shouldn't do that in the first place. Secondly, you have the trauma center that's supposed to warn you against what you do is bad. That's also not working. So it's a vicious cycle that keeps on going. And that is why it's very, very difficult to break any addiction, because of the mechanics of these two systems, and especially with gaming, because gaming has other things also built into it that makes it even worse. Right. So if we move on. Okay. So a lot of people always ask me, so is gaming good or bad for a learning brain? All right. So there was a study done in the University of Iowa in 2014, and they had 45 adolescents exposed to this study. So the study was divided into two groups. One group was exposed to aggressive games for between 2 to 3 hours per day for 3 weeks. And the other group, the control group, was exposed to a less aggressive game for 2 to 3 hours for 3 weeks. Okay. So they did this study, and then they did a functional MRI, what they call a weighted functional MRI on the two different groups, to see what the effect was of aggressive gaming on the one side and then the control group on the other side. And in this study, they actually saw through the functional MRI imaging, there was a decreased density and volume in the gray and white matter in the group that was exposed to aggressive gaming. And this to me was very shocking. So you can think to yourself, if there is a decreased volume and a decreased density in gray and white matter, obviously that's going to mean there's going to be something wrong with the brain. The brain is not going to function properly. And when they did further investigation and looked at the specific areas that were targeted, they saw that it was the prefrontal cortex, it was the thalamus, the parietal lobes, and the limbic system that was affected. All right. So we're going to talk about these areas quickly after this, but just to mention to you, we told you that the prefrontal cortex, this part, the front part of the brain, is responsible for the inhibition control and also responsible for the higher cognitive function, personality, and reasoning skills, right? Think about it this way. The prefrontal cortex is the red light. So if you think about a robot, the red light tells you not to do something. But if the robot is not working, I mean, you've seen what happens in load shedding. Nobody knows what's going on in a four-way stop or when the robots are not working. So this is exactly what happens when the prefrontal cortex, the red light, is not working. It's chaos in the brain. So the thalamus is the part of the brain that is your relay center. So think about this part of your brain as a call center. If you phone Vodacom, normally they're going to tell you, okay, press 1 for sales, press 2 for client care, press 3 for accounts. And so it directs you to a specific area. So the thalamus, that is the function of the thalamus. The thalamus is almost like a relay to send the specific information to the proper areas in the brain. So you can think to yourself, if the thalamus is not working properly for any reason, what's going to happen to the incoming stimulus? A child is going to be overwhelmed with too much stimulus coming in and is not going to be able to place those information in the proper areas of the brain. And what is the condition that we talk about now? It's called ADHD, hyper attention deficit disorder. Okay. If we think about the parietal lobes is the part of your brain that's responsible for analytical things, like, for example, mathematics, language, and those kind of things. So obviously, if there's a problem with the part of the brain or decreased density or volume in the brain that is responsible for mathematics, for language and reading, obviously the child's going to suffer with low mathematics marks, probably with reading, dyslexia, language problems. So again, if you see a child, the math marks are dropping between 10 and 20% quickly and suddenly, this is normally where you go. You always look for screen time, but you specifically look for gaming. Okay. Now, another thing, recent studies have shown that gaming is beneficial to children. So I was very interested to read this study because you always just see the headlines. A new study has now proven that gaming is actually good for children. And I thought to myself, okay, let's read the fine print. And I was reading through it, and the study said that gaming is good for spatial orientation, for reaction time, and task shifting. So I thought to myself, okay, but are any of these three things beneficial to a child that is supposed to learn or focus or have attention in the class? The last thing you want in a child that is concentrating on a teacher and responsible for focusing and attention is spatial orientation is not going to help him at all. Not going to be beneficial to a learning child. Reaction time, not beneficial to a developing child. And task shifting is the last thing you want in a child that is supposed to focus on a teacher telling him, how a specific thing is working. I mean, if you task shift, it causes a lot of energy to be depleted. Glucose are wasted when you task shift. So when you are task shifting, it depletes the brain of glucose. So you cannot function properly in the brain if you don't have that petrol or gas to drive the brain properly. So I just thought I will mention this. This is very, very important. Also, when you're reading studies, always read the fine print. So learning demands focus, attention, task specific, and is also metabolic taxing in itself. So if you learn something, they say that if you involve more senses in the learning process, it's going to increase the retention and the learning process. Okay. And if you're going to involve more senses in the learning process, it will take more energy. If it takes more energy, it will take more glucose. So you already need all the glucose you have available to learn effectively. So you cannot afford to lose energy in task shifting or other kind of activities. Like I said, more senses involved in the learning process, it increases the attention and retention. And we also have to remember, very importantly, gaming is a very primitive action. And response and learning is complex. So if you play a game, if someone shoots at you, instinctively, you're going to shoot back. It doesn't really involve too much higher brain function, because if someone's going to shoot at you and you're in the middle of a fight, you're not going to think about, okay, if this guy's going to shoot at me, I have to run behind this car, run up that hill, sit on the top of that hill. I have to switch my gun to a sniper rifle, and then I have to shoot that guy. There's simply no time for this. It's a very, very quick action reaction kind of response. So if you learn, if he shoots, I shoot. If he shoots, I shoot. Click, 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 click. That tells you that it doesn't involve higher cognitive function. It's a very primitive thing. And that is also why people will tell you that gaming actually makes you stupid, because obviously there's no higher function involved in, for example, specifically in first-person shooters or high adrenaline forms of gaming. Right, like I said, the structural and the functional brain changes that happens because of aggressive gaming. I told you about this, told you about the gray matter, told you about the white matter, and also we have to remember neuroplasticity occurs. So when you're playing aggressive games, your brain is again going through the process of neuroplasticity, where it forms specific neurons to make that activity more effective. And the other ones are lost. So if you use your brain to play first-person shooters a lot, the brain areas that's supposed to be used for functioning, like focus and attention, is not used, and they're all wasted away, basically. Okay, I'm just going to quickly put this up. I think we are recording everything. We unfortunately don't have time to go through all of these, but this is going to be behavioral indicators. You're going to look in the child, psychological indicators, academic indicators. These are all things you're going to see in a child that is exposed to excessive gaming. All right, and then the last one is going to be relational science. Also very important that a child that plays a lot of games, they want to be isolated. That's unfortunately the way it works. And then because they're isolated themselves, they withdraw themselves either from their family or their friends, right? I just want to see what we have. And obviously, very important also, they are very prone to have conflict with family members, and especially with their parents, because they become very rebellious and very aggressive. Okay, I think we're going to leave it at that for now, and I think I'm going to leave it open to any questions that you might have. Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much, Eldred, for such an informative and insightful presentation. I know we've learned a lot about the effects of gaming, and you've highlighted also the effects that it has on our brain. At this time, I'm going to open for questions.